Welcome to today's episode of IUC Talks. My name is Helen, and today's episode focuses on global food governance. And we know that food is not just about nutrition, it's about power, politics, economics, and justice. And to unpack this, I am joined by someone who has spent decades in the intersection of food systems and global policy spaces. And she has built an extensive career at the Food and Agriculture Organization at the United Nations, where she had several senior roles, eventually leading organization engagement with civil society. Today, she is dedicated to work in writing and also in teaching us of all she has learned within the policymaking industry and within the UN. And she's developing some discourse on the peasant movement and also a relationship between the UN and the civil society. She's also an authored publisher, and we have on set today a couple of her books. So I advise you check it out, yeah. And a lot of publication also within the food system. And I present to you Nora McKeon. Welcome to this podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you so much for the introduction. It was very flattering.
Thank you so much. So let's dive right into the questions right now. Okay, I'll be taking my first question on something very generic about the food governance. We know that in recent years there have been disruptions, many issues within conflict and the supply chain shock. So I want to know, do these crises expose weakness of the global food governance? Are there symptoms of a deeper systematic issue within the global food governance?
I think they are symptoms of a very deep systemic uh, crisis, which is not only about governance, it's about the way in which we undertake provisioning food in this world. The series of crises, one after the other, have simply served the pandemic, the Ukraine situation, the terrible situation in Gaza, the financial crises, food price volatility. All of these are a series of crises which which exist and continue to accumulate because we never address the real structural issues that are involved. Food is a basic human right. It's a basic human need. Delivering enough of it to serve to feed the needs of the population is a basic uh, objective of all governments, all societies. And why is it that we're not being able to do a good job of it? There are structural issues that really need to be addressed.
Yeah, this is quite interesting. So we are looking at structural issues that are not just food related, but also within other spheres of the global economy or even the global way of living. Okay, I'll go into the next question, which is something about the global south, because you've done a lot of work with the present movement and you've done a lot of work within West Africa. So I would love to know, how can global food governance better reflect the reality of the global south rather than imposing the top to down solutions that we see today that are not really working? So,
Well, the very way that you have asked the question gives you the answer, not top down, but bottom up.
yeah.
And in fact, in West Africa, as in Africa in general, and in the global south in general, it is these small scale family farmers, peasant populations who actually produce most of the food that is consumed in the region, and yet they are invisible. Up until recently, they have been invisible because all of the quote unquote development policies and support has been in favor not of supporting them, but of, on the contrary, supporting urban populations, more unruly, more likely to descend into the streets and create problems for governments, and successively, under colonialism, of course, we know what that was like. And since independence, we have seen the growing concentration of corporations and their managing of global supply chains, which are a different world from that of the small scale producers who actually feed the population. What has happened in West Africa, but not only, is that these people have organized, and they have organized into strong platforms representing the needs of small scale producers and building alliances with consumers, with other actors, because it's not just about meeting the needs of small scale producers. Of course, it's about building societies in which the society as a whole decides how they want their food provisioning to be organized. And there's a term for that, food sovereignty, which is the clarion call of peasant movements around the world, including in the global north.
This is interesting. I think the key word here is food sovereignty for me. And there have been a lot happening in this space, but I have another question to just add up to this, just to bring in, because we know that recently there have been a lot of digitalization within the food system. And when you talk about the peasant movement, the ideology I get is that culture is mixed together with actually growing of food. But now I will be asking this question. We are seeing the rapid rate of innovation, and this is what the corporate companies have been using actually to grow food to make profit. So, from AI into food system to alternative protein, who is governing this transition, and what does it mean for the global south, even at now?
Well, the problem is that nobody is governing the transition. And if there's not accountable public sphere governance, then lo and behold, the economic interests take over the role. And this is what we're seeing. We're seeing that AI, for example, is not governed at all. There's no international global governance of AI. And the kinds of rules that are put in place, even in other areas like international trade, financial speculation, are regulations that are not meeting the needs of people on the planet. So the question is, how do we turn that around? And again, my answer is from the bottom up, by building political agency on the part of the people of the world, but also with assists from regulation that can be put in place at the global level. Just to name one, what about debt? The unsustainable and inequitable levels of debt that African governments are facing today is not God-given. It's there because there have been poor policy choices in the past, and it could be decided to cancel it and free up funds that governments, if they are accountable, can use to provide support for the family farmers who are feeding their people and maintaining the environment.
This is very interesting. Yeah. Like me coming from West Africa, so I can relate with this so well. Yeah. Okay. But now we have to go into more questions right now, because now we know that the major issue that is troubling the global food system is not just about policy. Let's talk about something that is very recent of now that is taking impact in the global stage, which is climate change. So with climate change increasing and affecting crop yield and food prices, do you think that the global governance system are adapting fast enough for it, or is it also a space where the corporate organization kind of take over?
Well, this is a very good illustration of what we were saying at the beginning, that there are structural issues that underlie the series of crises that have been added one layer after another. I don't think I have to tell you that the so-called climate crisis is a man-made crisis, or a human-made crisis, rather.
Yeah.
And so, how do we address it? Why did we get here to begin with? And it's not enough to just worry about adaptation. The question is, how did we get here, and how do we address the structural issues that got us here? And if I can name a taboo name, but I don't think it's taboo at the IUC, I would name capitalism. Capitalism has not existed forever. People have organized their economies, their societies before capitalism existed. There are indigenous peoples who have totally different cosmologies and different ways of thinking about the economy and the society. We have a lot to unlearn and a lot to learn. And I think, but of course, to answer your immediate question, of course, the climate crisis is being used as a way of co-opting. I mean, just imagine the whole idea of carbon swaps is incredible if you think about tackling structural changes. You can go on polluting so long as you grow trees somewhere else, and you grow the trees by grabbing land that belongs to indigenous peoples. It's a cyclical reinforcement of the problems that got us here to begin with.
Yeah, this is quite very interesting. I think something I saw in within one of the work that you actually presented, maybe outside this, is something that caught my attention. That when it comes to climate challenges, they have existed even before this time. And you made an illustration of how local farmers were able to adapt and also forecast these changes within the environment and were able to adapt to it. So do you have something to share within this means on how the local peasant farmers or small scale farmers also kind of adapt to climate changes when we think about things like drought or maybe lack of water within an environment, maybe within Africa or any other place that you can make mention of?
Well, there you're asking very good questions that open up room for all sorts of
Yeah.
answers. And first of all, I would say that the so-called drought-resistant crops are not necessarily, and in fact, they shouldn't be a product of genetic modification of seeds that the farmers have produced. But indeed, farmers in areas that are prone to drought or where the agriculture is rain-fed have always been developing drought-resistant crops. The problem is that it's not these crops that are being promoted. It's not the local crops, but it's the big staple commodities that have taken over the world market and have taken over the food requirements of poorly urbanized societies. So the first answer is just go back to the drought resistant crops that farmers have been developing for years. The second is that farmers, and when I say farmers, of course, I'm always remembering that the majority of them are women. Farmers know their land, they know their territory, they know how to read the signs of what's happening in the climate. In the example that you referred to, this is the big drought of the mid 1980s in much of Africa, and the farmers knew way before the drought crisis hit the headlines. They knew what was coming because they were able to. So for forecasting based on traditional understanding of the weather is a good part of it. And also, farmers have developed various ways of, for example, catching and using water. There's so many innovations. We tend to think of innovation as something that's linked with high-tech technology, but farmers innovate on their land constantly. They're in Burkina Faso, there's a tradition of digging sort of holes in which in which rainwater is conserved and is then available for keeping the soil moist. There, any country you go to, if you talk to the farmers, you will find ways of adapting. So I'm not saying that in the kind of climate crisis that we've gotten ourselves into, this is enough. And certainly the marriage of respectful science and people's knowledge is a good way to go. But I am saying, for example, that one of the big choices is, do you continue supporting industrialized agriculture, which is actually prone to increase the climate crisis, or do you support agroecological approaches to farming, which work with nature and help to keep the soil in good condition and moist? These are all choices that end up being political in the end.
Very much interesting. A lot to unpack here. Yeah. So you made mention of agroecology, which caught my attention. So, and we know that the mindset of a normal person out there is that how do we get data from these small scale farmers? It's always the challenge. And what do you think that bodies like the UN, which you have been a part of, how do you think that they can actually make this better for the small scale farmers here? Because you mentioned that they are working a lot to make them more visible in displaying right now, but do you think that they can do more also for the small scale farmers to get their data out there and also make them more visible so that people would understand what is happening within the global food governance?
Yeah, okay. Well, let me say, first of all, that when we talk about the UN, when we talk about FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, people tend to talk about it as if it were something there without remembering that the UN and the FAO are, in the first instance, the member governments. Of course, there is the management, there are the technical experts who can be more intelligent, less intelligent, more capable and less capable. But in the end, food security, food sovereignty is about power and about politics. And if the member governments are not accountable to people, are not listening to people at their own level, it's very difficult to imagine that at the global level you can invent something just out of nothing. But having said that, institutions can be more or less open to listening to the voices of people. The first book that I published before the one that you shared with our spectators was entitled The UN and Civil Society, and I was doing a cross UN system look at how the different agencies related to civil society and who in civil society. Was it just NGOs, or was it people's organizations that actually represent those sectors of the population that are most affected by the policies that the UN deals with? And there was a lot of variation. So institutions can indeed open up help to the member governments end up deciding, but institutions can come up with proposals, with ways of listening more to civil society, to people's organizations, of collaborating with them, of reminding member governments that these voices are there and need to be attended to. So yes, more can be done.
Okay. I was drawn particular to the way you distinguish NGOs and people's movement or people's organization. Can you share more light on that so that our viewers can have a better understanding on the difference between these two?
Right. Well, I don't want to be simplistic,
Yeah.
but being simplistic,
Yeah.
I can say that NGOs are not-for-profit organizations which can do valuable advocacy work, humanitarian work on behalf of sectors of the population, but they do not represent these sectors of the population. Whereas people's organizations, I understand as organizations that are created by, established by, and are accountable to these sectors of the population, like the peasant organizations of West Africa, for example. And I don't mean by that to make a good-bad distinction. I'm above all looking at making distinctions, looking at differences, and making sure that we respect a situation of legitimacy. NGOs are not legitimate to speak for people in the global south, to speak for peasants, to speak for urban poor, urban populations that are food insecure, and yet too often, particularly in the past, they have tended to do so and to raise money, to raise funds on behalf of their villages, their populations, and this is something that we need to be attentive to. But there can be excellent partnership between NGOs and people's organizations in which the NGOs bring their capacity for analysis, for advocacy, etc., so long as it's a partnership in which it's the people's organizations that have the leading role in deciding politically what the messages need to be, what the choices need to be made.
This is absolutely interesting, and we have learned so much from you. And I am so happy to have you on set because even sitting with you is like a transfer of a lot of knowledge right here. And I must ensure that our viewers also think so. So I want to thank you so much for this time that you spent with us in this episode. And I hope that you continue in the advocacy, and the much that you do will be heard by many, and many youths will take up this mantle to do more within the civil society to ensure that food is sustainable, the global politics about food is moving the right way. Thank you so
Well,
much.
thank you very much for the invitation and the excellent questions.
Yeah, thank you.